They called her plain, too quiet, too serious, not pretty enough. For years, Abigail Miller listened as the world praised everyone around her while treating her as if she didn't matter. But when greed, vanity, and betrayal threatened to destroy her future, the very qualities people ignored became her greatest strengths. This is a story about a woman who learned that character shines brighter than beauty, and that true value cannot be measured by appearances. If you enjoy stories that restore your faith in human dignity, stay with us. And please support the channel with a like, a comment, and a subscription.
The wind off the Colorado River didn't care that Abigail Miller was getting married tomorrow. It blew cold just the same, rattled the loose boards on the barn. 5 in the morning. It was always 5 in the morning. Abby carried a tin pail of feed across the frozen dirt. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, quiet, just the crunch of her boots and the low clucking of the hens. She scattered the grain, pumped the water, hauled the firewood to the kitchen stove. She did it all with a steady, mechanical grace, a ghost haunting her own life. Tomorrow she would marry Charles Montgomery. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a fence post being moved from one side of the property line to the other, practical, necessary, completely devoid of feeling. By the time the sun finally crested the ridge, the coffee was boiling and the biscuits were in the oven. The floorboards creaked overhead. Her father, Samuel, came down first. He looked tired. He always looked tired these days, carrying the weight of a dying farm on his stooped shoulders. Then came Sarah. Sarah was 16, and she was beautiful. It wasn't the kind of beauty you had to look for, it just hit you. Bright blonde hair, eyes like summer grass. She sat at the table, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, looking like a painting. Abby set a plate of eggs in front of her father. Samuel took a bite. He looked at Sarah, smiled a little. "Your hair looks nice this morning, Sarah. I just woke up." "Papa?" She laughed softly. Samuel nodded, taking a sip of his black coffee. Then, without looking at Abby, he let the words slip out, careless, casual, like dropping a match in dry brush. "Abby, I'll tell you, if your sister were just a bit older, the Montgomerys wouldn't have needed to think twice about this arrangement." Silence. The crackle of the wood stove suddenly sounded terribly loud. Sarah stopped smiling, looking down at her hands, her cheeks flushing bright red. Abby didn't drop the coffee pot. She didn't cry, she didn't even blink. She just finished pouring her father's cup, set the pot on the cast-iron stove, and wiped her hands on her apron. She was used to it. The unspoken truth of the Miller house. Abby was the hands that kept them alive. But Sarah was the prize. "You don't matter," the silence in the kitchen said. "You are just useful." By noon, the Texas sun had warmed the red dirt of Dusty Creek. The town smelled of pine sawdust and old leather. Abby stood on a small wooden pedestal in the back room of Martha Higgins' dress shop. The wedding dress was plain, stiff white cotton, high collar, no lace, no pearls. Charles had picked it out himself from a catalog in his father's bank. He said it was sensible. Martha, a woman of 55 with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing, knelt on the floor with a mouthful of pins. She adjusted the hem, pulled the fabric, sighed. Martha stood up. She took the pins out of her mouth and looked at Abby in the mirror. "It's a terrible dress," Martha said. "It's practical," Abby replied, staring at her own square-jawed, tired reflection. "Charles says we shouldn't waste money on frivolities." Martha turned Abby by the shoulders. She didn't look at the dress. She looked right into Abby's hazel eyes. "Listen to me, Abigail," Martha said, her voice dropping low, firm, like a judge handing down a sentence. "Marriage is not a bill of sale, and a woman's worth isn't determined by who chooses her at the altar. It is determined by the strength of her own 2 feet when she walks away from a bad deal. Are you selling yourself short to save your father's pride?" Abby looked away. Her throat felt tight. "My father needs the Montgomery Bank to extend the loan. If I don't marry Charles, we lose the farm. It's my duty." Martha shook her head, her hands warm on Abby's cold arms. "Duty is what you owe the dead, child. You owe the living the truth. A man who buys a wife to save a debt isn't looking for a partner. He's looking for property. Never let a man convince you that your only value is what you can do for him." Abby swallowed hard. The words sank deep, settling into a place inside her she usually kept locked tight. For the first time in years she felt a dangerous little spark of anger, of dignity. She turned back to the window. Outside, walking down the dusty boardwalk, was a man, tall, shoulders like an axe handle, a faded silver deputy's star pinned to his vest. Wyatt Callahan. He was Charles's best man. Wyatt stopped across the street. He rolled a cigarette, struck a match on the heel of his boot, and cupped the flame. As he inhaled, he looked up, straight through the glass of the dress shop window, straight at Abby. He didn't look away. Most men looked right through her, or they looked past her, searching for her sister. But Wyatt Callahan stopped. His blue eyes were quiet, heavy. He looked at her standing in that stiff, ugly white dress, and he didn't see a practical arrangement. He saw the tight jaw, the defensive posture. He saw a wild, intelligent thing that had been broken and hitched to a wagon it didn't belong to. He saw her. Wyatt slowly tipped the brim of his hat to her through the glass. A small, silent gesture of profound respect. Not pity, respect. Abby's breath hitched. She raised her chin, just a fraction of an inch, and nodded back. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle. Tomorrow she would marry Charles. But as she watched Wyatt Callahan walk away, his boots kicking up the red Texas dust, a strange thought crossed her mind. For the first time in her life, Abigail Miller didn't feel entirely invisible. The church in Dusty Creek smelled of old wood, candle wax, and rain that hadn't fallen yet. It was 10 in the morning. Every pew was packed. When the son of the town's only banker got married, people showed up. They wore their Sunday best, the wool smelling of mothballs and cedar chests. They wanted a show. They wanted to see the Miller girl get lucky. Abby stood in the small room behind the altar. Her hands were cold. The white cotton dress felt like armor made of ice. Sarah stood beside her, holding a bunch of wild primroses. Sarah's knuckles were white. Her face was pale, almost gray. She looked like she was the one walking toward a firing squad. "Abby," Sarah whispered. Her voice shook. "You don't have to do this. We can leave. Walk out the back." Abby looked at her little sister. She reached out, straightening the blue ribbon in Sarah's hair. "Papa needs the loan, Sarah, it's done." "But it's not right," Sarah said. A tear tracked through the light dust on her cheek. "It's just not right." Abby smiled, but her eyes stayed flat. "Right is a luxury for people who don't owe money to the bank, little sister." Across the church, through the heavy oak doors, the noise of the crowd suddenly died down. The preacher took his place. The organ began to groan, its old bellows pumping air into the humid room. "Time," Abby said. She walked out first. The aisle looked a mile long. Hundreds of eyes hit her. She felt the weight of them. The women looking at her lack of lace, the men looking at her lack of hips. She kept her chin up. She kept her eyes on the altar. Charles Montgomery stood there. He looked handsome in his black broadcloth suit. His hair was slicked back with bay rum. He looked like success. But he wasn't looking at Abby. His eyes were slid to the side, watching Sarah walk behind her. Beside Charles stood Wyatt Callahan. Wyatt was a head taller than the banker's son. He held his Stetson in his large hands. His face looked like it was carved out of a river rock. When Abby looked up, his blue eyes caught hers. They didn't move. They held her steady, like an anchor in a bad current. Abby reached the front. She stood opposite Charles. The preacher cleared his throat. He opened the heavy leather Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began. His voice boomed against the pine rafters. Charles shifted his weight. He didn't take Abby's hand. He looked down at his own polished boots. Then he looked up at the preacher. "Stop!" Charles said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the church like a sharp knife through rawhide. The preacher froze. The organist hit a bad note, and the music sputtered out into a terrible echoing silence. Nobody breathed. "Charles," the preacher asked, his glasses slipping down his nose. Charles turned his body away from Abby. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the congregation. His voice found its strength, the arrogant strength of a man who owned the land he stood on. "I cannot go through with this," Charles said. He spoke to the pews, not to his bride. "A marriage must be built on truth. My heart belongs to another. I will not commit a sacrilege in the house of God by marrying a woman I do not love." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Somebody in the back dropped a hymnal. It hit the floor with a loud thud. Abby stood perfectly still. The blood rumbled in her ears, loud as a flash flood. She looked at Charles. He still wouldn't look back. He was looking past her shoulder. At Sarah. Samuel Miller stood up from the front pew. His face was purple. "Montgomery, what is the meaning of this?" Charles didn't answer. He turned on his heel, walked down the altar steps, and pushed open the side door. He walked out into the Texas sun, leaving the door swinging behind him. The church erupted. People stood up, whispering, pointing. Some looked horrified. Others looked like they had just been given a free ticket to a circus. Abby didn't move. She couldn't. Her boots felt nailed to the floorboards. The public shame was a physical weight. pressing down on her chest until she couldn't draw breath. She was the discarded girl, the ugly sister, left at the altar before the whole county. Samuel Miller crossed his arms, looking around the room in a panic, thinking of his debt. Not his daughter. He didn't come up to hold her. He didn't cover her. Sarah fell to her knees behind Abby, covering her face. Sobbing so hard her shoulders shook, Abby stood in the center of the storm, alone. Then came the boots, thud, thud, thud. Heavy leather on pine, slow, deliberate. Wyatt Callahan stepped across the altar. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Samuel. He walked straight to Abby. He stopped 2 feet away. He took off his hat, his dark hair messy underneath. He looked at her jaw. It was clamped tight. He looked at her eyes. They were wide, dark with shock, but there were no tears. Wyatt spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of iron. It carried over the murmurs of the crowd, silencing them row by row. "Miss Miller," Wyatt said, "if you'll still have it. I'd be honored to stand in that spot. I'll take the vows." Abby's mind struggled to grasp the words. She stared at him. "Wyatt, what are you doing?" "I'm offering you my name," he said. His blue eyes didn't waver. "If you want it." "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was thin as paper, out of pity. Wyatt shook his head. He looked around the church, his gaze cold enough to freeze water. Then he looked back at her. "There is no pity in honor, Abby. A person's dignity isn't something to be traded or thrown in the dirt when a better offer comes along. God made us equal in value, and no man has the right to make you feel small in this town. If you walk out of here alone, they'll chew on your name for 20 years. Walk out with me. Let's give them something else to talk about." Abby looked at his hand. It was large, calloused, square. It was the hand of a man who worked for his bread, who didn't live on interest rates and family names. Plicked, she looked at her father. Samuel was staring at Wyatt, a sudden desperate hope in his eyes. He didn't care who took her, as long as the Miller name wasn't ruined and some kind of alliance was kept. It was disgusting. She looked back at Wyatt. She raised her chin. "The preacher is still standing there, Deputy," Abby said. Wyatt smiled. Just a little. A quick flash of white in his sunburned face. He turned to the preacher. "Fix your glasses. Holy Joe, we have a wedding to finish." 10 minutes later it was done. Abigail Jane Miller was Abigail Callahan. They walked down the aisle together. Wyatt didn't rush. He kept his pace steady, his arm bent so she could rest her hand on his sleeve. The crowd shrank back as they passed. Nobody murmured. Nobody laughed. You didn't laugh at the man who carried a Colt 45 and a reputation for never breaking a promise. They reached the porch. The air was hot now. The dust was blowing. Wyatt helped her down the steps. As they reached the hitching post, Abby's foot hit something white in the dirt, a folded piece of paper. It had fallen out of Charles's coat when he ran. Abby picked it up. She didn't open it until Wyatt went to untie his horse. The handwriting was Charles S. Elegant. Perfect. It was addressed to Sarah. It was dated 3 months ago. "My sweet Sarah," it read. "Every time I look at your sister, my heart breaks because she is not you. This arrangement is for the banks, but my soul belongs to the beauty in your eyes. Wait for me. I will find a way." Abby closed the paper. Her fingers were shaking, but her face was stone. Charles hadn't suffered a sudden change of heart. He had been planning this humiliation for months, and her family had let her walk into it. She shoved the note deep into the pocket of her plain white dress. She looked at Wyatt, who was leading his bay horse toward her. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked. "Ready," she said. Wyatt's cabin sat 3 miles outside of town, right where the scrub oak started to give way to the low hills. It wasn't large. 3 rooms, logs notched tight, the mud between them dry and white. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dried chili peppers hanging from the rafters. He didn't carry her over the threshold. He didn't try to touch her at all. He set her small trunk by the door, took off his gun belt, and hung it on a wooden peg by the entrance. Then he went straight to the hearth. "Sit," he said, pointing to a rocking chair near the cold stove. "The wind is picking up. I'll get the fire going." Abby sat. The white dress felt heavy now, like a shroud. She watched him work. He was efficient. He used a small knife to shave tinder from a piece of cedar, struck a flint and blew the spark into a flame with patient, steady breaths. He didn't speak until the kettle was on. He poured 2 tin mugs of black tea and set one on the small pine table between them. "We need to talk," Abby said. Wyatt sat down on a hide-bottomed chair opposite her. He picked up his mug, his dark fingers wrapping around the hot tin. "I reckon we do." "You didn't have to do that," she said, staring into her tea. "You ruined your life today. Wyatt, you could have had any girl in the county. You could have left this place." Wyatt took a sip. His face didn't change. "A man's life isn't ruined by doing what's decent, Abby. It's ruined when he starts looking the other way, because doing the right thing costs him something." I've known Charles since we were boys. He thinks money buys him the right to treat people like cattle. I wasn't going to let him do that to you. Not while I had breath to stand up. But you don't love me, she said. It wasn't a complaint, it was just a fact. Wyatt looked out the small window. The sky was turning gray-purple as the sun went down. Love is a word people use when they want something from you. Abby, most times. It's just a feeling that goes away when the winter gets cold. I don't know much about it, but I know about a promise. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Here are the rules of this house. You re my wife by law, but you re your own woman by right. I don't own you. This cabin has 2 rooms with beds. The big one is yours. The small one behind the kitchen is mine. They'll provide the meat and the wood. You keep the house if you want, or you keep teaching school if you want. Nobody tells you what to do here. Not even me. We treat each other with respect as equals under this roof. That's my vow to you. Abby felt a strange tightness lift from her shoulders. For 18 years, her life had been a series of orders. Cook this, clean that. Smile for the banker, don't embarrass your father. Under this roof with this stranger, she was suddenly free. I want it in writing, she said. Wyatt blinked. My word isn't enough. I spent my whole life around men whose words were like smoke, Abby said, her voice sharpening. My father promised my mother he'd protect us. He didn't. Charles promised he'd marry me. He didn't. I want the rules on paper, Wyatt. I want to see it. Wyatt didn't get angry. He nodded slowly. He stood up, went to a small shelf and brought back a bottle of ink, a steel-tipped pen, and a scrap of ledger paper. He set them down. Write it, he said. Abby took the pen. Her handwriting was small, clean, and elegant. She wrote down his words. 2 rooms, separate beds, mutual respect, absolute freedom of choice. When she was finished, she pushed the paper toward him. Wyatt didn't read it. He took the pen, dipped it in the ink, and signed his name at the bottom in a heavy, dark scrawl. W.J. Callahan. There, he said. It's a law now. The next morning, the reality of Dusty Creek came knocking. They needed supplies. The cabin's larder was down to salt pork and cornmeal. Abby refused to hide in the house, so she put on her old calico dress, tied her hair back with a leather thong, and walked into town with Wyatt. The air at the general store was thick with tension the moment they stepped through the door. Mrs. Morton, the town blacksmith's wife, was standing by the dry goods counter. She was a woman with a mouth like a coin slot and a habit of knowing everyone's business. She turned around, her eyes widening when she saw Abby. Well, Mrs. Morton said, her voice carrying across the store, if it isn't the new Mrs. Callahan, we didn't expect to see you out so soon, Abigail. Most girls would be hiding under a quilt after what happened yesterday. The storekeeper stopped weighing flour. 2 men by the potbelly stove turned their heads to watch. Abby felt the old shame rising up her neck. Hot and suffocating, she opened her mouth. But before she could speak, Wyatt stepped up beside her. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, his massive frame blocking the light from the window. He looked down at Mrs. Morton. His blue eyes were completely empty of warmth. Morning, Mrs. Morton, Wyatt said. His tone was smooth as river silk. My wife and I are just getting some lard and coffee. If you've got something to say about our marriage, you can say it to me. But if you were just looking to spit poison, I suggest you take it out to the street. The air in here is heavy enough as it is. Mrs. Morton's face turned the color of a beet. She gasped, clutched her basket to her chest, and scurried out the door without another word. The storekeeper suddenly became very busy with his ledger. Wyatt turned to Abby. He didn't look proud of himself. He just looked practical. Get the coffee, Abby. I'll get the bacon. As they walked back to the cabin later that afternoon, the sun was sinking low, painting the long grass of the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Abby looked at the man walking beside her. He carried the heavy sack of flour on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He hadn't tried to hold her hand. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they left the store. Thank you, she said softly. Wyatt didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. For what? For Mrs. Morton. Wyatt stopped walking. He lowered the sack of flour to a flat rock by the side of the path. He turned to her, his face dark against the evening light. You don't thank a man for doing what is basic, Abby. Respect isn't a gift I'm giving you. It's a debt this world owes you. Every human soul has a right to walk down the street without being torn apart by dogs, whether those dogs wear pants or petticoats. If I don't stand up for you, I'm no better than Charles. Abby looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the small scar under his chin. She saw the dust in the lines around his eyes. He wasn't a hero from a storybook. He was just a man trying to live by a code that didn't allow for cowardice. You're a strange man, Wyatt Callahan, she said. I'm just a deputy. he said, lifting the flower back to his shoulder. The world is full of noise, Abby. Best to just do the work and keep your mouth shut. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but as the stars began to come out over the Texas plains, bright and cold as diamonds, Abby looked at the paper contract tucked into her pocket. It was just ink and wood pulp, but for the first time in her 18 years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. The second week of the marriage brought the quiet, not the heavy kind that settles before a thunderstorm, but a slow, rhythmic peace. Abby woke every morning at 4:30. The cabin was always freezing before the sun hit the logs. She didn't mind. She liked the dark. She liked the absolute silence before the rest of the county started demanding things from her. She would sit at the small pine table with a single tallow candle. In front of her was her mother's old journal. The leather cover was worn smooth, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old grease. Inside were the recipes, not for pies or biscuits but for survival. Willow bark for the heavy head, mullein leaf for the deep cough, crane's bill root to stop the bleeding. She was tracing her fingers over her mother's delicate script when a shadow moved in the doorway of the back room. Wyatt stood there. He was fully redressed, his boots already laced. Though he hadn't put on his gun belt yet, he looked at the book. He looked at the candle. "You're up early," he said. His voice was husky from sleep. "The mind works better before the world starts talking," Abby replied. Not closing the journal, she expected him to ask about breakfast. She expected the usual demands. Wyatt just walked over to the stove. He didn't say a word. He took the tin coffee pot, shook it to check the water, and set it on the iron top. He began to build the fire. He didn't ask her to help. He didn't look at her like she was neglecting her duties. When the coffee started to bubble, he poured 2 cups. He set one down right beside her book. "What's that you're reading?" he asked, leaning against the dry sink. "My mother's remedies," Abby said, taking a sip of the hot chicory blend. She learned them from the Choctaw women when she was a girl out in the territory. People in town call it witch doctoring, but it's just God's pharmacy. Every weed out there has a purpose if you take the time to listen to it. Wyatt looked at the page. His face was thoughtful. The town folks are mostly fools about things they can't buy in a glass bottle with a fancy label from St. Louis. But a man who disregards the earth he walks on is a man who won't last 3 winters out here. God didn't make this prairie empty, Abby. He filled it with tools. It takes a humble mind to recognize them. He took his coffee and went to the window, looking out at the gray light breaking over the hills. "You should keep reading. The schoolhouse needs you today anyway." The Dusty Creek schoolhouse was nothing but an old line cabin the ranchers had abandoned when the water went sour. It had 6 benches, a wood stove that smoked when the wind blew south, and 12 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Abby loved it. On those benches, she wasn't the girl Charles Montgomery left behind. She wasn't the ugly sister. She was the woman who knew where the stars went during the day and how to divide 16 by 4 without using her fingers. That afternoon, she brought a bundle of dried gray-green leaves into the room. She laid them on her desk. "Who can tell me what this is?" she asked the room. Little Toby Miller, no relation to her, just a boy with dirt on his nose, raised a sticky hand. "Mullein, teacher. My ma puts it in the chicken coop to keep the lice out." Abby smiled. "That it does, Toby. But it does more. If a winter cough takes you deep in the chest, you smoke this leaf or boil it into a tea. It opens the lungs, it lets the breath back in." She looked at the older girls on the back bench. Education isn't just about spelling words that someone else wrote down in a book across the ocean. It's about understanding the world right outside your own cabin door. A person who can read the land can never truly be helpless. Remember that. Knowledge is the only property the banks can't foreclose on. A shadow crossed the threshold. Wyatt was standing by the doorframe. He had his Stetson in his hand, his deputy star catching the light through the high window. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, watching her lead the children through their recitations. When the bell rang at 3, and the kids scattered out into the dust like a covey of quail, Wyatt walked inside. His boots sounded loud on the bare pine floorboards. "You're good at this," he said, looking at the chalkboard. "They're good children," Abby replied, packing her slates into a canvas bag. "They just need someone to see them. Most folks around here look at a child and just see another hand to pull cotton or brand calves." "I know the feeling," Wyatt said softly. They walked home together, the horse walking slowly behind them, the reins slung over Wyatt's arm. The sun was dropping, casting long, blue shadows across the mesquite flats. "Wyatt," Abby said, her voice quiet, "can I ask you something, if you want? Why did you stay in Dusty Creek?" He stopped walking. He looked down at the dirt, then out toward the horizon where the land met the big Texas sky. My mother died in this county. She buried under a lone oak 3 miles north of here. I couldn't leave her alone in the dirt, and your father. Wyatt's jaw tightened. The lines around his eyes hardened into granite. He left when I was 12, walked out one morning before the kettle was hot, followed a younger woman all the way to New Mexico, or so the story goes, left my mother with 3 cows and a mortgage she couldn't pay. He looked at Abby, his eyes dark with an old cold anger. I grew up thinking that betrayal was something carried in the blood, like a bad cough or a weak heart. I spent years terrified that one day I'd look at a hard winner and just run. Same as he did, that's why I took the star, Abby. Law isn't just about catching cattle thieves. It's about binding yourself to a post so you can't drift when the wind blows hard. I wanted to prove to my mother's ghost that a Callahan could stay. Abby didn't touch him. She just nodded. You're not him, Wyatt. I'm trying not to be, he said. The next morning, Abby went to the town square to fetch the mail. The air was crisp, smelling of morning frost and horse manure. As she passed the sheriff's office, the door opened and Sheriff Sterling stepped out. He was an old lawman with a white mustache and a bad knee from an Indian ball 3 decades ago. He stopped when he saw her. Mrs. Callahan, he said, tipping his hat. Good morning, Sheriff. Sterling leaned against the hitching post, looking down the street toward the bank. Wyatt home. He's fixing a wheel on the wagon, sir. The old man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He's a good lad, your husband. Foolish sometimes, but good. I reckon you know what he gave up to stay here this spring. Abby froze. Sir, Austin, Sterling said, squinting into the sun. The Texas Rangers sent a courier down here back in March. Offered him a captain's slot with the Frontier Battalion. 3 times the pay of a deputy, a house in the capital, and a name that would carry weight all the way to Washington. Abby's heart gave a strange, hard thud. He never told me, of course he didn't. Sterling grunted. Wyatt don't beat his own drum. But he turned it down the day after your father announced your engagement to Charles Montgomery at the church social. He told me he had business in Dusty Creek that wasn't finished yet. The old man nodded to her and walked off toward the cafe, his boots clicking on the boardwalk. Abby stood in the middle of the street. The wind blew a tumbleweed across her path, but she didn't see it. Wyatt hadn't just stepped up at the altar out of a sudden flash of pity or honor. He had marooned himself in this dry, forgotten town months ago. He had watched her from the shadows, giving up his own dreams just to be near enough to catch her if she fell. She walked back to the cabin, her chest aching with a feeling she didn't have a name for yet. The Miller farm looked smaller than Abby remembered. It had only been 3 weeks since she walked away from it in a white cotton dress, but as she rode up on Wyatt's old mare, the house looked gray. The paint was peeling off the porch columns like dead skin. The front gate was hanging by a single leather hinge. She had come to collect the rest of her mother's things, the spinning wheel and the small pine chest that held the old quilts. When she stepped onto the porch, the door opened before she could knock. Her father stood there. Samuel Miller looked like he had aged 5 years and 20 days. His shirt was unwashed and his eyes were bloodshot. Abby, he said. His voice was hollow. Father, she replied, keeping her voice even. He didn't invite her in. He just stood in the doorway, looking past her toward the road, as if he expected Wyatt to be riding behind her with a shotgun. You looks well, child. I am well, father. She pushed past him into the kitchen. The room was a mess. Unwashed plates sat on the table, the grease turned white and hard. In the corner sat Sarah. Sarah looked up. Her eyes were red, her face puffy from crying. When she saw Abby, she didn't run to her. She stayed in her chair, clutching a handkerchief to her mouth like she was afraid she'd vomit. Abby, Sarah choked out. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Abby sat down opposite her sister. She felt a cold, hard calm settle over her. She pulled the folded letter, Charles's letter, out of her pocket and laid it flat on the greasy table between them. How long, Sarah? Abby asked. Her voice was too quiet. Sarah looked at the paper. A fresh sob tore from her throat. 3 months. He started coming to the creek when I was washing the linen. He told me I was beautiful. Abby, he said you were a good girl, but you were like a winter tree, dry and silent. He said he couldn't live without light, and you believed him. I didn't mean to, Sarah cried, reaching out to grasp Abby's hand. But Abby pulled her arm back. He gave me ribbons, Abby. He told me he'd take me to San Antonio. I was stupid. I didn't think he'd really do what he did at the church. Abby looked at her little sister. The anger she expected to feel didn't come. There was only a profound, heavy sadness. Sarah was 16. She was a child who had been fed on compliments and vanity, until she didn't know the difference between a predator and a prince. Sickness doesn't always come with a fever, Sarah, Abby said, her voice dropping into the tone she used at the schoolhouse. Sometimes it comes in soft words and pretty ribbons. A man who flatters your vanity while destroying your sister's name isn't a man who loves you. He's a wolf who likes the color of your fleece. Sickness like that destroys a house from the inside out. Samuel Miller stepped into the kitchen. He didn't look at the letter. He looked at the floorboards. "Leave the girl alone, Abby," Samuel muttered. "She has suffered enough. The whole town is looking at us like we read dirt." Abby turned her gaze to her father, the man who had raised her, the man she had slaved for since her mother went into the cold ground. "You knew, didn't you?" Samuel didn't answer. "Look at me, father," Abby said. The old man raised his eyes. There was a pathetic, whimpering fear in them. "The bank was going to take the stock. Abby. Old man Montgomery told me plain if the marriage didn't happen. The note was due on the 1st of May. Then Charles came to me a month ago. He said he wanted Sarah instead, said if I kept my mouth shut and let him manage the switch at the altar, the loan would be extended for 5 years. The kitchen went entirely cold. Sarah gasped, looking at her father with horror. "Papa, you knew!" Samuel slammed his fist on the table, the plates rattling. "I had to save the land. What was I supposed to do? Let us all starve in the ditch? Abby is sensible, I thought. I thought she'd understand. She always does the duty." Abby stood up. The chair creaked behind her. She looked at her father, and for the first time in her life, she saw him clearly. He wasn't a patriarch. He was just a small, frightened creature who had traded his daughter's soul for 40 acres of dust and a herd of scabby cows. "You didn't save the land, father. You just rented your own cowardice from the bank. Human rights aren't something you can trade away to keep a roof over your head. When you put a price tag on your own blood's dignity, you aren't a father anymore. You're just a broker in a slave market." She walked out of the kitchen. She didn't take the spinning wheel. She didn't take the quilts. She walked out to her horse, mounted up, and rode away without looking back. The sky turned black before she reached the Callahan cabin. A blue norther was dropping down from the plains, the temperature plummeting 20 degrees in an hour. The wind screamed through the mesquite. When she let herself into the cabin, it was empty. Wyatt was out on a tracking detail. A horse thief had broken the corral at the stage station the night before. He wasn't expected back until morning. Abby didn't light the lamp. She sat in the rocking chair in the dark kitchen, her coat still pinned around her throat. The wind rattled the window panes until they sounded like teeth chattering. She felt completely hollowed out. The world she had built her life on, the idea of family, of duty, of her father's protection, was nothing but a lie told by weak men. She was 18, married to a stranger, and her own father had sold her name for a banknote. She took her mother's medicine journal from the table and held it against her chest. She began to cry. Not loud, just the silent, tearing tears of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. Hours passed. The candle burned down to a greasy nub. Around midnight, the door clicked. The cold wind rushed into the room, bringing with it the smell of horse sweat, wet wool, and frost. A large shape filled the doorway. Wyatt stepped inside. He saw her immediately. Even in the dark, he saw the slump of her shoulders, the white paper of the journal in her arms. He closed the door against the storm, took off his heavy buffalo hide coat, and walked over to the table. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't tell her to stop crying. He knelt down in front of her rocking chair. His face was gray with fatigue, his eyelashes frosted with ice from the trail. He reached out his big, rough hand, hesitating for a second. Then he gently took the journal from her shaking fingers and set it on the table. Then he did something he hadn't done since the day at the altar. He took both of her small, frozen hands into his own. He didn't squeeze them. He just held them between his massive palms, letting his warmth seep into her skin. "I heard in town," Wyatt said. His voice was low, vibrating through the quiet cabin. "I saw your father at the blacksmith. He told me what he did." Abby choked back a sob, looking away from him. "He sold me, Wyatt. He knew about Charles and Sarah for a month. He let me walk into that church like a pig to the butcher, just to save his cows." Wyatt didn't move. His hands stayed steady on hers. "Your father is a small man, Abby?" Wyatt said, his blue eyes burning in the dim light. "But his smallness doesn't define your worth. The world is full of men who will try to put a price on things that belong only to God: your mind, your heart, your dignity. But a price tag only works if you agree to let them buy you. You walked out of that house tonight. You didn't take their shame with you. That means you won, Abby. You re-free." Abby looked down at his hands. They were covered in dirt and horse grease. but they were the cleanest things she had ever seen. "You stayed here because of me," she whispered. "Sheriff Sterling told me about Austin, the Rangers." Wyatt stayed on his knees for a long moment. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with absolute honesty. "I stayed because this town didn't know what it had," he said softly, "and I wasn't going to let them destroy it before I had a chance to stand in front of you." He stood up then, letting go of her hands, giving her back her space with that quiet, innate courtesy that belonged only to him. He went to the stove to revive the fire. Abby sat in the rocking chair, her hands still tingling with the warmth of his touch. The storm was still howling outside, shaking the logs of the cabin, but inside, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a shield. The frost from the blue norther didn't stay long. In Texas, the weather changes its mind before a man can change his shirt. By Tuesday, the sun was back out, baking the red clay until it cracked like old pottery. Abby spent her afternoon in the dirt behind the cabin. She had a small hand plow, an iron thing she'd had dragged from her father's barn before the world went sour. She was digging a trench. It was hard work. Her palms were blistered through her canvas gloves. But she didn't stop. She needed a garden, a real one, not for potatoes, but for the things that healed. She was dropping dried horehound seeds into the loose soil when a shadow blocked the sun. Wyatt was standing there. He had his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his thick forearms dark from the sun. He looked at the row of seeds. Then he looked at her. "Horehound?" he asked. Abby wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of red dirt across her forehead. "For the lungs, Wyatt. Next winter will come, whether we re-ready or not. The town children get the croup every January. If I don't plant this now, they'll be breathing through fluid by the time the north wind hits." Wyatt didn't say anything. He just reached down, took the handle of the iron plow from her hands, and stepped into the row. He didn't ask her if she was tired. He just did the heavy pulling. His broad shoulders swung in a rhythmic, easy arc, slicing through the clay like a knife through lard. Abby watched him work. He didn't look like an officer of the law. He looked like an extension of the earth itself. When he reached the end of the fence line, he wiped his neck with a blue handkerchief. He looked back at her small paper packets of seeds. "My mother used to say that a town without a proper healer is just a graveyard with a post office attached. People think a community is built on brick buildings and bank vaults, Abby, but it ain't. It's built on how well you look after the weak when the winter gets long, you redoing the real lawyering out here in the dirt. More than me and my tin star." Abby felt a small, warm pressure behind her ribs. She took a step closer to him. "You went to the bank yesterday, Wyatt. Sheriff Sterling told me you were in town." Wyatt's face went still. He looked down at the plow. "I had business." "You paid my father's interest," she said. "It wasn't a question. You used your savings from the Ranger days. Why?" Wyatt took off his Stetson, letting the dry prairie wind run through his dark hair. He looked out at the hills. "Because a debt is a leash, Abby," he said, his voice dropping into that low, flat register. "As long as Samuel Montgomery held that note over your father's head, he held a knife to your sister's throat and yours. A man who owes another man his livelihood isn't free. He can't make an honest choice. I didn't do it for your father. I did it so the Montgomery name wouldn't have any power under this roof. You don't owe them a single breath. Not anymore." He set the plow down by the well house, pulled his hat back over his eyes, and walked toward the corral to feed his bay. Abby stood in the middle of her half-planted garden. The paper packet of seeds was crumpled in her fist. For 18 years. She'd been told that she was a burden, a mouth to feed, until someone took her off her father's hands. But Wyatt Callahan didn't look at her like a bill to be paid. He looked at her like a woman who deserved to be clear of the trap. The fever hit Dusty Creek 3 nights later. It wasn't the slow, lingering kind. It was the red throat croup, the one that makes a child's throat swell until they sound like a barking dog. Dr. Vance was 30 miles away in San Saba, fixing a broken thigh bone on a cattle driver. At midnight, the sound of galloping hoofs woke the cabin. A young farmer named Miller, no kin, just a neighbor from down the creek, pounded on the door. His face was white in the moonlight. "Deputy, my little girl Mary. She's choking, her throat like a piece of raw meat. She can't get the air in." Wyatt was out of bed before the man finished speaking. He didn't look for his boots. He looked at Abby. Abby was already dressed. She had her mother's leather satchel in her hand. Inside were the dried roots of cranesbill and the dark, sticky syrup of wild cherry bark she boiled down last autumn.
"Get the horse,"
she said. Her voice was sharp. "Sure." They rode double through the dark, the wind cold against Abby's face as she clung to Wyatt's waist. When they reached the Miller cabin, The sound from inside was terrible, a dry, rattling gasp, a child fighting for every inch of oxygen. The mother was frozen by the hearth, holding a 4-year-old girl whose face was already turning the color of a wet slate. Abby didn't hesitate. She took the child from the woman's arms. She didn't look at the dirt on the floor or the greasy rags by the bed. She looked at the throat. Wyatt. Abby barked. Get a pot of water on the fire. Throw a handful of that dried mullein from my bag into it. We need the steam now. For 2 hours. The cabin was nothing but heat, smoke, and the smell of bitter herbs. Abby worked with her sleeves rolled up, her fingers covered in the dark syrup as she forced a thin willow twig down the girl's throat to keep the airway from closing completely. She didn't look at Wyatt. She didn't look at the weeping parents. She was the law in that room, the only thing standing between the child and the dirt yard outside. Around 2 in the morning, the rattling stopped. The girl's chest began to rise and fall in a long, deep, greasy sigh. The color came back to her cheeks, not the bright red of the fever, but the soft pink of life. She fell asleep against Abby's apron. The mother collapsed against her husband, both of them shaking, their faces wet with tears. Abby laid the child on the bed. She wiped her hands on a damp cloth. Her shoulders were aching, her eyes burning from the wood smoke. Wyatt was standing by the door frame, his massive shoulder leaning against the cedar log. He had been there the whole time, keeping the fire hot, handing her the tins of water without a single word of doubt. He looked at her, really looked at her. On the ride back, the sky was turning the color of a wet pearl. The prairie was silent. Wyatt guided the mare with one hand. His other arm was wrapped around Abby's waist, keeping her steady against his chest because she was trembling with exhaustion. You did something grand tonight, Abby, he said into the dark. I just used what grew in the creek, she murmured, her head resting against his wool vest. No, Wyatt said. His voice was thick with something he couldn't quite hide. People think a doctor needs a diploma from a school in Boston to be worth something. But healing ain't about Latin words, Abby. It's about having the stomach to look at a dying thing and not run away. You gave that little girl her life back tonight. Don't you ever let this town make you feel like you're less than the best thing in it. Abby didn't answer. She couldn't. Her heart was beating too fast against his ribs. When they reached the cabin door, Wyatt dismounted and reached up to lift her down. His hands caught her waist. He didn't let go immediately. He held her there, her boots dangling an inch above the red dirt, her face close to his. The truest thing in Texas was the quiet between them right then. Wyatt looked at her mouth. His blue eyes went dark. For a second, just one. Abby thought he was going to break his own written contract. She wanted him to. Then he set her down gently. He took a step back, his boots crunching on the gravel. Go on inside, Abby, get some sleep. I'll look after the mare. She walked into the dark cabin alone. But the room didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like it was waiting for him. A lie faster than a good horse in a small town. By the middle of May, the story about the little Miller girl had faded, replaced by something much more entertaining to the folks who gathered around the porch at the general store. Abby felt the change the moment she walked into Dusty Creek on Friday morning to deliver a basket of dried peppermint to the schoolhouse. People didn't look away anymore. They stared. The women whispered behind their fans, their eyes sliding down Abby's calico dress like they were looking for a tear. She was crossing the street toward the apothecary when a horse pulled up short in front of her, kicking up a cloud of red dust that made her cough. Charles Montgomery sat on a big, high-crested gray stallion. He looked as fine as ever, his leather boots polished to a high shine. But his mouth was twisted into a small, ugly sneer. Abigail, he said, not bothering to take off his hat. Abby stopped. She didn't look up at him. She looked at his horse's bridle. Mr. Montgomery Charles leaned forward over his saddle horn. His voice was low, but it had that oily, confident ring of a man who owned the bank. I see you're still playing the dutiful wife out at the Callahan place. Tell me, does the deputy treat you well, or does he just use you to scrub his floors and fry his bacon? Abby raised her eyes then. They were flat, cold. My life is my own business, Charles. Move your horse, Charles laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. Your business. The whole town knows your business, Abby. Your husband didn't step up at that altar because he thought you were some kind of prize. He did it because he had a point to prove to me. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. He shook it at her. 2 months ago, Charles said, his eyes gleaming with a malicious joy. Before the wedding ever happened, Wyatt was sitting in the back of the Lone Star Saloon with the cattle drivers from the Chisholm Trail. He made a wager with Big Pete Gandy. $50 silver, that he could take the plainest girl in the county, the one nobody wanted, and make her love him in 60 days just to prove a Callahan was better than a Montgomery. Abby's tongue felt dry. That's a lie, is it? Charles smiled, and it looked like a snake sliding through wet grass. Ask him about the $50, Abby. Ask him why he turned down the Rangers to stay in the dirt. He didn't stay for you. He stayed to win his bet and put his boot on my neck. You're just the chip he used to play the game. He wheeled his gray horse around and galloped down the street, leaving Abby standing in the dust. The red dirt felt like it was spinning under her boots. The old wound, the one that told her she was nothing but a convenience, a tool to be used by men, opened up like a fresh cut from a razor. When she got back to the cabin, Wyatt wasn't there. He was out fixing the boundary fence by the creek. Abby sat at the kitchen table. She didn't take off her bonnet. She didn't put the kettle on. She just sat there, staring at the paper contract they had signed 3 weeks ago. W.J. Callahan. His signature looked heavy, aggressive, like a mark made by a man who knew exactly what he wanted to conquer. A plain girl, the voice in her head whispered, the one nobody wanted. The door opened around 5. Wyatt walked in, his shirt soaked with sweat, his boots caked in gray creek mud. He took off his Stetson and hung it on the peg. He looked at her. He saw the bonnet still on her head. He saw her hands clamped tight in her lap. Abby, he asked, his brow furrowing, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Abby stood up. Her chair didn't creak, it slammed back against the log wall. Did you make a bet at the Lone Star Saloon? Wyatt. The words came out before she could stop them. Raw, sharp. Wyatt stopped in the middle of the room. His whole body went rigid, like a horse that smells a painter in the brush. His blue eyes went narrow. Who told you that, Charles? She said. Her voice broke, and that made her angrier. He said you wagered $50 silver with Pete Gandy. He said you called me the plainest girl in the county. He said you stayed here to win a bet and prove you were a better man than him. Wyatt didn't speak for 5 long seconds. The silence in the cabin was suffocating now. It didn't feel like a shield anymore, it felt like a grave. It wasn't like that, Wyatt said. His voice was too quiet, too flat. Did you talk about me in that saloon? Abby demanded, taking a step toward him. Before the wedding. Did you name me to those cattle drivers? Wyatt looked down at his boots. He cleared his throat. Pete Gandy was drunk, Wyatt said, his jaw working. He was saying things about you, Abby. Things about how Charles was too good for a girl who spent her time digging in the mud for roots. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about. I said any man with half a brain would see you were worth more than all the gold in the bank. Pete laughed. He said I couldn't make a girl like you look at a man like me if I had 60 days to try. I threw a silver dollar on the table. I told him to shut his mouth, so there was a wager, Abby whispered. It wasn't a bet about making you love me, Wyatt said, his voice rising, a rare flash of heat in his eyes. It was about defending your name. A name can't be defended in a saloon with whiskey and silver, Wyatt, Abby said, the tears finally spilling over her lashes, hot and bitter. When you bring a woman's dignity into a room full of drunkards and throw coins on the table to prove a point, you aren't protecting her. You were just using her name to feed your own pride. You wanted to beat Charles. That's all this ever was. The wedding, the contract, the interest on the note. You just wanted to show this town that a Callahan stays when a Montgomery runs. I was just the horse you rode to win the race. Wyatt looked like she had hit him with an iron rod. The color drained from his face, leaving the scar under his chin looking white and angry. Abby, he said, reaching out a hand. That ain't true. You know that ain't true. I don't know anything, she said, backing away from him until her spine hit the kitchen cupboard. I don't know who you are. I want my space. Wyatt, I want you to keep to your side of that paper. Wyatt's hand dropped to his side. He looked at her for a long, terrible moment, his blue eyes full of a pain that looked older than the town of Dusty Creek. He didn't argue. He didn't try to force her to listen. He turned around, picked up his Stetson from the peg, and walked out the door. He didn't take his horse. He just walked out into the gathering Texas twilight, his long legs moving fast, disappearing into the dust and the shadows of the mesquite flats. Abby sank into her chair, burying her face in her apron. The cabin was completely silent now. The wind had died down, but the air felt heavier than it ever had during the Blue Norther. She had her space. She had her contract, but as she sat alone in the dark kitchen, she realized that the walls she'd have built to keep from being hurt were the exact same walls that were keeping her out in the cold. The town of Dusty Creek didn't stop for a broken heart. Sunday morning came around, heavy and hot. The air smelled of baked dust and the scorched grease from 100 cook stoves. The church bells began to clang at 9. their iron tongues calling the righteous and the unrighteous alike to the wooden pews. Abby rode in alone on the mare. She didn't stay at the cabin with her grief. A woman who hides in the hills after a rumor hits is a woman who admits she's beaten. She wore her gray calico, no ribbons, no lace. Her face was washed clean, her jaw set like a stone wall. When she tied the mare to the hitching post outside the church, she saw Wyatt. He was leaning against the oak tree near the steps. He looked like he hadn't slept since Friday. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw covered in a dark, rough stubble. His deputy star was pinned straight on his vest, but his shoulders looked heavy, like he was carrying a sack of lead. He looked at her as she walked up the steps. He didn't move toward her. He didn't say a word. He just took off his hat, holding it against his thigh, letting her pass into the building without forcing his presence on her. Abby walked down the center aisle. The whisper started before her boots hit the second row of pine planks. Look at her. Did you hear about the bet? $50 silver. The plain one. She sat in the third pew from the front, right across from the Montgomery box. Charles was there. He sat next to his father, old William Montgomery, who looked like a bull in a broadcloth suit. Charles had a smug, easy smile on his face. He looked at Abby, then he looked back toward the rear door. Sarah was sitting in the very back row, tucked into the shadow of the balcony stairs. She looked small, frightened. The preacher, Holy Joe, opened his Bible. He preached for 40 minutes about the sins of the flesh and the fires that wait for the liar. Every word felt like a stone thrown at Abby's head. She kept her eyes on the altar. She didn't flinch. When the sermon was over, the preacher didn't give the blessing. He cleared his throat and stepped out from behind the heavy oak pulpit. "Before we close this house today," the preacher said, his voice echoing off the pine rafters, "the community has a matter of secular governance to address. The town council meets here on the final Sunday of May. If any citizen has a grievance or an announcement for the public good, let them stand." Silence fell over the room, heavy. Expectations ran high. Everybody looked at Charles. Charles started to shift his weight, preparing to stand, ready to deliver the final blow to Wyatt's name. But he didn't get the chance. From the very back of the church, under the dark stairs, a small, clear voice rang out. "I have something to say." Every head in the church snapped around like a flight of geese hitting a sudden wind. Sarah Miller stood up. She was 16, and her hands were shaking so hard she had to clutch the back of the pew to keep her knees from buckling. Her face was white as a peeled potato, but her eyes weren't crying. They were bright, sharp with a sudden, desperate courage. She walked down the center aisle. Her boots made a light, tapping sound on the pine. She didn't stop until she reached the front. Right between the preacher and the Montgomery pew, Sarah. Samuel Miller muttered from his seat, his face turning dark red. "Sit down, girl." Sarah didn't look at her father. She looked at the whole town. "Most of you know my face," Sarah said. Her voice shook on the first few words. Then it found a hard, flat rhythm. "You know it, because you spent the last 2 years telling me I was pretty. You told me my hair was like gold and my eyes were like the grass. You fed me on those words until I was stupid enough to think they meant something." She reached into her small reticule and pulled out a bundle of folded papers, the white linen paper Charles had used. "These are letters," Sarah said, holding them up high so the light from the stained glass hit them. "They read from Charles Montgomery. He started writing them to me 3 months ago. He gave them to me by the creek while my sister was home making the bread that kept our family alive." A loud, collective hiss went through the pews. Old William Montgomery stood up, his fists clenched. But Sheriff Sterling put a heavy hand on the old man's shoulder and shoved him back into his seat. "Charles told me he loved me," Sarah continued. Looking straight at the banker's son now, Charles was staring at his own knees, his face the color of old lard. "He told me he'd take me away from the dirt. He told me my sister was plain and dry, and that he was only marrying her because his father owned our farm's note. He asked me to wait for him. He told me he'd find a way to break the arrangement at the altar so he could have the pretty one instead." She turned toward Abby. Her eyes went soft. "A lie is like a wild fire on the prairie. Neighbors, it looks bright and beautiful when it starts, but it don't care what it burns. Charles didn't leave my sister because he had a sudden fit of conscience. He left her because he's a thief who tried to steal 2 sisters' lives at the same time. He used my vanity like a trap." She looked back at the congregation, her voice growing louder. "And those stories you read telling about Deputy Callahan, about a saloon bet, I know the truth of that too. Big Pete Gandy told my father the whole story last night because he was ashamed of his own mouth. Wyatt Callahan didn't bet $50 to shame my sister. He threw his own money on a filthy barroom table because he was the only man in this county with the guts to tell a pack of drunkards that Abigail Miller's name was sacred. He didn't use her. He defended her when her own blood stayed quiet. Sarah dropped the letters on the altar rail. They hit the wood with a soft, dry slap. "I am 16, she said, her chin coming up, looking exactly like her sister for the first time in her life. "I was foolish enough to let a snake into our house because his scales were shiny, but I'm a Miller, and I won't let my sister carry the weight of a coward's lies just to keep this town entertained." She turned around and walked out of the church. She didn't look back. The silence she left behind was absolute. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. The truth had come into the room like a cold wind, blowing away the dust and the cheap gossip, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly shape of Charles Montgomery's vanity for everyone to see. Abby stood up. Her boots were loud on the floorboards as she walked toward the door. As she passed Wyatt by the oak tree outside, she stopped. She didn't look at his star. She looked at his hands, the big, scarred hands that had thrown silver on a bar to keep her name from being dragged through the mire. "Wyatt," she said. "Abby," he replied, his voice rough. "Come home," she said softly. "The garden needs water." He looked at her for a long 3 seconds, then he nodded, reached for his horse's reins, and followed her into the red dust. The heat of the afternoon stayed in the logs of the cabin long after the sun went down. Abby sat by the open window, the cool air from the river finally beginning to move through the grass. On the table sat a wooden box. It had arrived that morning by the stage courier from Lincoln County, New Mexico. It was wrapped in greasy oilcloth, addressed to Wyatt J. Callahan. The return name was Margaret Cole Wyatt's mother's maiden name. She had passed away in a sod house out near the Pecos River the winter before. This was her ledger, her final accounting. Wyatt sat across from her. He hadn't taken off his boots. He had a small stag-handled knife, and he was using it to carefully slice through the thick twine that bound the package. He pulled out an old book. It was an old merchant's ledger. The leather back cracked and stained with grease from a dozen campfires. "Open it," Abby said. Wyatt hesitated. His large fingers hovered over the cover like he was afraid the paper would burn him. Then he opened it to the first page. The handwriting wasn't elegant like Abby's mother's. It was short, blunt. The writing of a woman whose fingers were stiff from lye soap and hoeing corn. Wyatt read the lines in silence. His jaw began to work, a hard lump forming at the corner of his mouth. He didn't speak for 5 minutes, just turning the heavy yellow pages, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps through his nose. "Wyatt," Abby asked, reaching across the pine table to touch his sleeve. "What is it?" Wyatt didn't look up. He pointed a thick, dark finger at a page dated August 1865. "Read it," he whispered. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. Abby leaned over the table. She read the fading ink. "Robert is gone today. He didn't take the bay mare or the wagon. He took nothing but his old saddle and the clothes on his back. He didn't follow the girl from the livery, like the town is saying. He told me the truth before he walked out the gate. The dark days have taken him completely now. He sits in the corner for 3 days without a word, staring at the logs, seeing things that ain't there. He told me he feels the madness coming on like a winter freeze. He said his own father died in a madhouse back in Illinois, chained to a wall because he didn't know his own children." Abby stopped. She looked at Wyatt. He was staring at the candle flame, his face completely gray. Abby went back to the ledger, her voice dropping lower as she read the next paragraph. "Robert said he'd rather his boy grow up hating a father who ran than terrifying a boy with a father who went crazy in the kitchen. He said a boy can survive an angry memory, but he can't survive watching his own blood turn to stone in front of him. He made me promise to tell Wyatt he went to New Mexico with a woman. He said the lie would keep the boy from looking into his own mirror every morning and wondering when the darkness would start for him. God forgive us both. The lie is heavy, but the truth would kill the lad's spirit." The ledger page ended there. The only sound in the room was the low, steady click of the clock on the shelf and the crickets out in the mesquite flats. Wyatt sat perfectly still. A single tear, heavy and slow, tracked through the dust on his sunburned cheek, disappearing into the dark stubble of his jaw. He was 25 years old, and for 13 of those years he had carried the weight of a traitor's name in his veins. He had lived in terror of his own shadow, binding himself to a tin star and a hard code just to keep from turning into the monster he thought his father was, and it was all a lie. His father hadn't been a coward. He had been a broken man who tore his own heart out and threw it in the dirt just to keep his boy from inheriting his ghosts. He stayed true. Wyatt whispered, His hands were shaking now, the old ledger paper rattling between his fingers. He didn't run because he was weak. Abby. He ran because he loved me enough to let me hate him. Abby stood up. She didn't stay on her side of the table. She walked around the pine boards, stepped close to his chair, and did what she hadn't allowed herself to do since the day at the church doors. She reached out and pulled his large dark head against her waist. Wyatt didn't pull away. He leaned his forehead against her calico apron, his thick arms wrapping around her hips, clutching her like a drowning man clutches a cedar log in a flash flood. His broad shoulders began to shake. He didn't sob loud, he was a Callahan, and Callahans didn't make noise when they bled, but his chest heaved against her ribs, releasing 13 years of accumulated terror into the quiet room. Abby smoothed his dark, rough hair with her palm. The past isn't a shadow that has the right to follow you forever. Wyatt, she said, her voice steady and warm in the dark. A man don't inherit his father's sickness any more than he inherits his father's boots. God gives every soul a clean slate when they come into this world. You spent 13 years proving you're a man who stays. You don't need the law to hold you to the post anymore. You're holding yourself. They stayed like that until the candle burned down to the wood, the darkness closing in around them, warm and thick with the smell of dry grass and old leather. The next morning, the sun came up clear and bright, burning the mist off the Colorado River until the valley looked like green velvet. Abby was out in the garden, a tin bucket of water in her hand, splashing the liquid over the small green sprouts of the horehound. Wyatt came out of the cabin. He had washed his face, and his jaw was clean-shaven for the first time in a week. He didn't have his gun belt on. He just wore his white linen shirt and his gray trousers. He walked down the path, his boots light on the red clay. He stopped by the garden fence, watching her work. Abby, he said. She looked up, squinting into the morning glare. Yes, Wyatt. He leaned his long arms over the top rail of the cedar fence. I didn't step up at that church doors because it was my duty, he said. His voice was quiet, but it had a different ring to it today, lighter, like the river water when the mud settles. I've watched you for 2 years, Abby. I watched you teach those children when the wood stove was freezing. I watched you collect those roots from the creek when your father didn't even notice your boots were wet. I saw a woman who was worth more than this whole county put together. And I was terrified Charles would take you to San Antonio and shut you up in a big brick house where nobody would ever see you shine. He looked down at his large hands on the rail. I threw that silver on the table because I was angry that the world could be so blind. I wanted to be the man who stood between you and the dogs. I didn't do it to beat Charles. I did it because I wanted to come home to this cabin every night and know that the best thing in Texas was sitting under my roof. Abby set her tin bucket down in the dirt. She walked to the fence, her boots leaving small, neat prints in the mud. She reached over the cedar rail and placed her small, calloused hand flat against his chest, right over the place where the tin star usually sat. I don't need a deputy, Wyatt, she said, her hazel eyes looking straight into his blue ones. No, he asked, his voice dropping low. No, she smiled, and it was the first real, unclouded smile she had given him since the morning at the farm. I just need a husband who knows the difference between a weed and a cure. I think you'll do. Wyatt reached over the rail, his large hand wrapping around hers, his fingers warm and certain against her skin. The wind blew off the river, sweet with the smell of damp willow and green corn. They had a hard winter ahead, and the town of Dusty Creek would always have its stories. But as they stood together in the morning sun, Abby knew that the roots they had planted in the dry soil were deep enough to hold them both against any storm the prairie could bring. 3 months can change the face of a town. By the end of August, the red clay of Dusty Creek was baked hard as a brick. The summer heat sat heavy over the valley, making the horses sluggish and the men irritable, but the talk had changed. The whispers under the church porch had dried up and blown away with the dust. Abby sat at her kitchen table, the big window wide open to catch the evening breeze off the Colorado. In front of her was the medicine journal. It was thick now. The old leather cover was bulging with new pages she had sewn into the spine with heavy linen thread. There were drawings too neat. Detailed ink sketches of leaf shapes, seed pods, and root systems. Sarah sat opposite her, a fine-tipped steel pen in her fingers. She was leaning close to the tallow lamp, carefully shading the edge of a wild cherry leaf on a fresh sheet of paper. Her fingers were stained with black ink, but her face was quiet, peaceful. Is the vein too thick, Abby? Sarah asked, holding the page up to the light. Abby looked at the drawing. She smiled, reaching across the table to touch her sister's wrist. It's just right, Sarah. A doctor needs to see exactly where the sap runs. If a man mistakes hemlock for wild parsnip because the drawing is poor, the blood stops before the sun goes down. Sarah nodded, going back to her work with a steady hand. I like the drawing, Sarah said softly, her voice rhythmic and low against the click of the kitchen clock. It makes me feel like I am fixing something I broke. Sickness ain't just about the body, Abby. I used to think that as long as a girl was pretty and spoke soft, she was doing her part. But vanity is like a rust on the plow. It looks like gold when the sun hits it, but it eats the iron until the machine is useless. This book, it feels like real work. Abby watched her sister's head bend over the paper. Every soul has to find its own tool. Sarah, Abby said, you found yours with the pen. The front door opened with a slow, familiar creak. Wyatt walked into the kitchen. He had his heavy boots on, caked in gray river silt from the flats. He took off his Stetson and hung it on the wooden peg by the dry sink. He didn't look like a deputy anymore. He didn't wear the tin star. 2 weeks ago, old Sheriff Sterling had officially handed in his keys. The town council had held a vote under the oak trees behind the courthouse. They didn't even look for another candidate. Wyatt Callahan was sworn in as the new sheriff of Dusty Creek by unanimous consent. He didn't brag about it. He hadn't even bought a new shirt for the ceremony. He just took the keys, locked the cells, and came home to help Abby pull the weeds from her whorehound Rose. Wyatt walked over to the table and laid a heavy leather pouch next to Sarah's drawing paper. It clinked with the sound of solid silver. What's that? Abby asked, looking up. The Montgomery Bank is closed, Wyatt said. He sat down heavily in the high-bottomed chair by the hearth, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Old William Montgomery sold the building and the land to a syndicate out of San Antonio yesterday afternoon. They're moving the ledger books out by wagon tomorrow morning. Abby felt a strange, cold stillness hit the room, and Charles. He's on the stage tonight, Wyatt said. His blue eyes were calm. Clear, he's going east. His father told the sheriff's office they won't be returning to the county. The name is done here, Abby. The town won't carry it no more. Sarah didn't look up from her drawing. Her pen kept it steady, scratching rhythm against the paper, but her shoulders dropped an inch. A long, quiet sigh slipping past her lips. The trap was finally gone. He came to the jail before he left, Wyatt said, looking at Abby now. He wanted to give me back the interest money I paid on your father's note. He said he didn't want anything belonging to a Callahan in his pockets. Wyatt reached out and touched the silver pouch with his long, dark finger. I told him the money wasn't a gift and it wasn't a bribe. I told him it was the price of his absence. A community can survive a drought, Abby. It can survive a fire or a hard freeze, but it can't survive a man who thinks his wealth gives him the right to buy the honor of his neighbors. I told him to take the silver to San Antonio and see if it could buy him a clean name there, because it won't buy him one in Dusty Creek. Abby stood up from her chair. She walked over to his side of the room, her calico skirts rustling softly against the floorboards. She stood behind his chair, her hands resting flat on his broad shoulders. She could feel the heat of the sun still trapped in the wool of his vest. You did right, Sheriff, she whispered. Wyatt reached up, his large, rough palm covering her hand, holding it tight against his collarbone. We did right, Abby. The next afternoon, the buggy pulled up the trail. The horse was old, its head hanging low in the August heat. Samuel Miller sat on the bench, holding the reins with loose, trembling fingers. He didn't get down. He just sat there in the sun, looking at the neat rows of green herbs behind the cabin, his old felt hat crumpled in his lap. Abby walked down the path alone. She didn't hurry. Her boots made a dry, crunching sound on the gravel. She stopped by the wheel of the buggy. Her father looked small. His hair was completely white now, the skin on his neck loose and wrinkled like an old boot left out in the rain. Abby, he said. His voice was thin. Father, she replied. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the well house where Wyatt was stacking cedar logs for the coming winter. The farm is sold, Abby. I paid off the small debts at the store. I've got enough left to buy a room at the boarding house in town. I don't owe the bank a single cent. He looked at her then, his old blue eyes watery, full of a pathetic, begging look that made Abby's throat ache. He wanted her to tell him he was a good man. He wanted the easy grace she had given him her whole life. Abby didn't give it. Paying the bank don't erase the ledger, Father, Abby said, her voice steady and flat as the prairie horizon. A man can clear his debt with gold, but he can't clear his responsibility to his children with a receipt from a clerk. You chose the dirt over your daughter's names. You have to live with that choice, your daughter, and I'll always see that you have a hot meal and a dry place to sit. But I won't tell you the transaction was honest. It wasn't. Samuel Miller looked down at his knuckles. A tear dropped onto his gray trousers, leaving a dark, round stain in the fabric. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just nodded his old head. "Slow and heavy, I know," he whispered. "I know, Abby." "Get down from the buggy, father," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "The kettle is on. Come have a cup of tea." The old man climbed down, his boots shaking as they hit the red clay. He followed her up the path, walking small, a guest in the house of the daughter he had tried to sell. Twilight came on slow that evening, the big Texas sky turning from gold to a deep, bruising purple over the western hills. The crickets were loud in the long grass, their dry rhythm filling the valley. Sarah and Samuel had gone into town with the wagon to fetch the rest of the books from the schoolhouse. The cabin was quiet. Abby stood on the front porch, her hands wrapped in her apron to keep them warm against the first cool breeze of the night. Wyatt came out from the barn. He had washed his hands at the pump, his dark hair damp and curling against his neck. He walked up the steps, his long legs moving with that easy, tireless stride that belonged only to him. He didn't stop until he was standing right beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. The ledger scrap from their first morning under this roof. The contract. He held it out to her in the dim light. "What's this for?" Abby asked, looking at his heavy scrawl at the bottom. "W.J. Callahan." "The 60 days are up today, Abby," Wyatt said. His voice was low, vibrating through the quiet porch. "That's what Charles said the bet was. 60 days to make you love me." Abby looked at the paper. She didn't take it. She reached out, her fingers twisting into the wool of his vest, pulling him just an inch closer to her. "Do you think you won the wager, Sheriff?" she asked, her hazel eyes bright in the twilight. Wyatt took the paper, crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist, and tossed it over the rail into the dry dirt yard. "There ain't no wagers between equals, Abby," he said, his blue eyes holding hers with absolute certainty. "A contract is for people who are afraid the other person will run when the weather gets hard. I don't need a law to keep me on this porch. And I don't need a piece of ledger paper to know that my soul belongs to the woman who stands her ground when the rest of the world goes crazy. I'm here because I choose to be every day, for the rest of the winter." He leaned down then. His face was close. Abby didn't back away. She didn't look at her boots. She raised her face, her hands coming out of her apron to wrap around his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp hair. The kiss was like the rain they'd been waiting for all August. Slow, deep tasting of salt wood smoke and the clean, cold water of the river. It wasn't a promise made for the neighbors or a deal struck for the banks. It was the honest accounting of two souls who had looked into the dark and found their own light. When he pulled back, his large hand stayed on her waist, holding her close against his chest. "The wind is turning north," Wyatt said, looking out over the hills where the first stars were beginning to break through the purple sky. "Let it blow." Abby smiled, her head resting straight against his heart. "We got deep roots, Wyatt. We going to stay." The Botanical Dictionary of the Colorado Valley was completed in the spring of 1879. The cover was made of thick buckskin, tanned by Wyatt's own hands, and the title page bore 3 names written in clean, elegant script. Margaret Cole Abigail Callahan Sarah Miller. It was the first book of its kind in the territory, a record of every root, leaf, and bark that could cure a fever or stop a bleeding wound. Dr. Vance, when he returned from Sansaba, carried a copy in his saddlebag until the day he died, though he always claimed he only kept it to correct the spelling. Wyatt Callahan served as sheriff of Dusty Creek for 11 years. He never drew his Colt against a citizen of the county, and he never broke a promise made under his own roof. When the town grew too large and the railroad brought the brick buildings from the east, he and Abby moved out to the hills near Austin, where Abby had been asked to open a school of nursing for the women of the frontier. He went with her without a single word of complaint. He liked the hills, he said, but he liked his wife Brain more. Sarah Miller never married. She stayed in the small cabin by the creek, her drawings of the Texas wildflowers appearing in scientific journals as far away as Philadelphia and London. She became the first woman in the state to be paid for her intellect, and she never wore another silk ribbon as long as she lived. And Samuel Miller spent his final winters sitting by Wyatt's hearth. He was an old man who had lost his farm, but in the evenings, when the north wind screamed through the logs, he would watch his daughter Abby lead the town women through their medical recitations. He would take a sip of his horehound tea, look at his daughter's straight spine, and finally understand that the greatest value of his house had never been the land. It had been the girl he thought was invisible, who had taken the dust of a broken promise and built a sanctuary that nothing in Texas could tear down. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And so, as the dust settles over Dusty Creek and the evening wind moves softly across the Colorado River, this story leaves us with more than a romance, more than a tale of betrayal, and more than the triumph of two wounded souls. It leaves us with a quiet truth. Every person deserves to be seen, valued, and loved without being bought, measured, or traded. Abigail Callahan began this journey as the invisible girl under the roof. She was useful, obedient, and overlooked. Her family saw her hands, but not her heart. They saw what she could sacrifice, but not what she could become. And yet, through pain, humiliation, and disappointment, Abby discovered that her worth was never decided by her father, by Charles Montgomery, by gossiping neighbors, or by any man standing at an altar. Her worth had always been there, steady and unbroken, waiting for her to claim it. Wyatt Callahan's love was not loud. It was not dressed in pretty speeches or easy promises. His love showed itself in restraint, respect, protection, and patience. He gave Abby space when the world had only given her orders. He stood beside her without trying to own her. He taught us that true love does not cage a person. True love gives them room to breathe, room to choose, and room to stand tall. This story also reminds us that dignity is not something others give us. It is something we must refuse to surrender. Abby was humiliated in front of an entire town, betrayed by her own father, and wounded by her sister's weakness. But she did not let shame become her name. She turned pain into purpose. She turned her mother's medicine journal into healing. She turned a broken promise into a sanctuary. And in doing so, she proved that the person others underestimate may be the very one who saves the whole community. Sarah's journey teaches another lesson. Beauty without wisdom can become a trap. But mistakes do not have to define a life forever. When Sarah finally told the truth, she stepped out of vanity and into courage. Her redemption came not through excuses, but through honesty, work, and the willingness to repair what she had helped break. Samuel Miller's story is a warning. A man may save his land and still lose his honor. He may pay every debt at the bank and still owe a debt to the people he failed to protect. The story asks us to remember that family should never be used as currency, and no roof is worth keeping if it is built on someone else's humiliation. And Charles Montgomery represents the emptiness of pride without character. Wealth, charm, and status may impress a town for a season, but they cannot build a clean name. In the end, a man is not remembered for what he owned. He is remembered for how he treated those who had less power than him. The deepest meaning of this story is simple but powerful. Love, respect, and freedom must be chosen every day. Abby and Wyatt did not build their life from perfection. They built it from dust, broken trust, hard truth, and second chances. Their home became strong because it was founded on equality. Their love endured because neither of them had to disappear inside it. So So when we remember Abigail standing on that porch beside Wyatt, with the north wind turning and the roots growing deep beneath the dry Texas soil, we are reminded that no one is truly invisible forever. Sometimes the world overlooks the quietest soul in the room until the day she rises, speaks, heals, forgives, and builds something no cruelty can tear down. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. We are not defined by who failed to see us. We are defined by what we choose to build.